Alright, in this video we're going to talk about writing blocks. Writing blocks is one of those things that has a tremendous return on investment because having pre-prepared arguments and statements that you are going to answer things with, make sure that you don't forget some of your best arguments that you might be wanting to go for in a particular debate round. So, just being able to have that stuff pre-prepared, thought out really well in advance, it always has tremendous impacts on your win percentage and always will help. So, first, we will look at what are blocks. Blocks are pre-prepared statements to or for a particular argument or position. So, blocks are an umbrella term for just having pre-written out what you want to say. Front lines are kind of a synonym, for blocks. So, all front lines are blocks. Not all blocks are front lines. So, it's one of those square rectangle situations. And so, don't worry too much. If it's confusing, you can ask for clarification from either an older classmate or from a teammate or a coach. They should be able to tell you. But just know that blocks are pre-prepared statements that you have already thought out and know exactly what you want to say. I generally think that there are three types of blocks that occur. There are overviews to positions. There are answers to. And what answers to do is they respond to initial arguments from the other team. So if you are affirmative and a team answers some of your advantages in the 1 and C, you will have answers to blocks so that you can answer the arguments that they put forth in the 1 in C. Therefore, your 2AC is pretty much pre-prepared for that segment of the debate. And it means that you don't have to spend very much prep time thinking about what you're going to say. Then there are front lines to positions. These are our initial responses to a position. So if we're negative, it could be our pre-prepared arguments that we want to read against the other team's solvency or a particular advantage that they're reading. Or it can be a front line to, when we're AF, it can be a front line to a position they read, like a disad, a critique, a counterplan, topicality, all of those types of things. So when we're looking at overviews as the particular type of block that can be written, we're going to talk about multiple different types of overviews. So the first type of overview we're going to talk about are counterplans and for counterplans and critiques. The thing that you're first going to do in your overview is you're going to explain what the alternative or the counterplan is. What does it do? The second thing you're going to do is you are going to explain why it's different from the affirmative. What is that stasis point that makes that point of contention between the negative and the affirmative that makes them not the same? And if you're trying to solve for the AF with your alternative or your counterplan, you got to explain how that functions. And critiques oftentimes will put framework arguments here that are arguments about how debate might not leave the room, or judges should be social advocates, or whatever sort of framing and judge instruction that they want the judge to occupy positionally for evaluating the debate could go there in that framework argument. And then the last thing that I think is always important for these types of overviews is what is the net benefit? Make sure it's crystal clear to the judge that voting for this counterplan has X net benefit. You can see this is an example of a critique. You can see that the first paragraph there is an explanation of what the argument is. And then it talks about how there are impacts to that argument in the second paragraph, and why those are the most important impacts in the debate. Then it explains what the alternative does, and why the alternative would be able to solve for war. And those are all super helpful. Here's one for a counterplan. It says, hey, here's this key thing. Resolved means to be firm, which means that the affirmative can't permute our counterplan, and there are two reasons for that. Listen, the counterplan does these town hall meetings before having the AF actually be put into place, which means that there's an addition of time that would take place, and so it answers the permutation right then and there with sort of an overarching argument. And it explains why it solves the AF and what that big difference is, i.e. the component of time is added to the counterplan that prevents the AF and the negative from being the same. Then there are overviews for disadvantages. These are pretty simple. They are going to be a short summary of what the disad says, hopefully in less than 3 sentences. Sometimes you will do impact calc if you think that your impacts are really big and should come before everything else in the debate. And if you can talk about why the impacts to the disad turns the AF, that is always a super good thing to have there as well. So if you look at this, for example, you look at these, the first paragraph says, hey, here's what's happening right now, and here's our disad. This is how it functions. It's 3 lines. Studies indicate the economy is doing well, but the plan is going to raise taxes, which causes the economy to collapse, results in war. That's bad. Then it has, here's why this impact comes before everything else. That's impact calculus. And lastly, it has an argument as to why, if there was a war to take place, it would cut back the funding for the plan and mean that the plan wouldn't actually be able to solve for any of the problems that they're trying to do. When we look at overviews for topicality, there's usually a summary of the argument, and it extends the definitions and violations when there are impact turns going on. So if they say topicality is bad and should never be run, that's when you would extend across the definitions and violations in your overview. And then if there's just a counterinterpretation with corresponding standards, then you are going to extend across the voting issue and your conceded standards and explain why those conceded standards should be outweighing their counter standards. So think about topicality overviews as this. You are going to extend across any conceded parts of your 1NC topicality show. And that's how you should sort of treat it when you're dealing with topicality. You're going to just make sure that you extend across the big arguments that were conceded in the 2AC. When you're looking at critique affirmatives, overviews can be helpful because they can help have key framing discussions, perhaps like what the role of the judge is, how we should understand the purpose of debate, what is the goal of debate, is it policy making, is it being an advocate, are you being an individual, is this an educational space, or is this just a place to get attention to potentially get some scholarship money? Those framing arguments should be made up at the top of critique affirmatives. How does your particular affirmative influence or effectuate what the role of the judge is, and what is the best role of the judge that you could possibly have in order to maximize your chances of winning? They will often give us a 3 to 5 sentence summary of what the affirmative is and key impact framing arguments, especially when they're not responsive to certain things. So this is a longer version of a 2AC overview, which is okay. It is a long version of it, but there are they had this long sort of overview because a lot of teams were not being responsive to the arguments inside of the 1AC, and so they found making sure that all of their arguments are extended in this overview was super beneficial and helpful in order to make sure that the judge understood exactly what they were voting for when they voted for it. All right, now you can draw a line, and we're going to talk about the second category of blocks that you could write, and that is the answers to section. Debate learning is team AT, not team A2. But with that said, if you are looking at a file, AT and A2, like the number 2, mean the exact same thing. They are answers to. Answers to's are usually used in one role, and that is to have pre-prepared answers to initial arguments that are read. So you will have specific, you'll have answers to specific 2AC arguments made when you're negative. So like maybe the 2AC said permutation do both. You will have an answers to permutation do both, and you will already have a pre-scripted set of arguments that you want to read when the 2AC says permutation do both. Or maybe you have 1 and C arguments you hear often, and so you pre-script your 2AC answers to those 1 and C case arguments. So the 1 and C stood up and said, case doesn't solve because blah, 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 blah. Well, the 2AC will have an answers to block that pre-scripts how they want to answer that blah, 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 blah argument. And that way cuts down on prep time and ensures that they're answering it in the most effective way possible. There is a second place where answers to can happen, but this is far less common. And this is when you have specific case arguments you want to read in certain situations. They'll be labeled as answers to sections of files. Usually this is dealing with specific solvency mechanisms, or most often it's about impact defense. So let's say that the affirmative has an economy causes war impact. You might have an answers to section where you have pre-selected arguments that you are going to read when they say economic collapse causes war. When you're dealing with answers to, those blocks should be formatted in the 3 R's and the C. If you don't know what the 3 R's and the C is, that's a different video on the website on how to extend evidence. And you should look over that for a more in-depth analysis of what the 3 R's and the C are. But know this. It's refer back to the original evidence that was already read, refute the warrant that the argument was read against you. So sometimes this will be blank, or it will be something you will insert into a block during the particular debate you are having. So you can read the warrant of their evidence and make sure that you are answering that warrant as explicitly as possible. That way, that modification makes it seem and makes it answered more genuinely and have more fidelity to what needs to be said. Read more. Sometimes reading more evidence is important in debates because there's a big debate. Like if it's a solvency argument that would crush your case, it's probably a good idea to read more solvency cards in order to make sure you win that claim in the debate. And then the compare section. Why is your evidence preferable? Is it from experts? Is it more up to date? Does it take certain things into consideration? Is it comparable? Does it take their evidence into account? All of those types of compare arguments can be arguments as to why your evidence should be preferred over theirs. And that's the format you use for an answers to block. So they said permutation do both. You are going to extend cards that you have already read that explain why they cannot permute it. You will refute the warrant they have in either their speech or cross-ex as to why they would be able to do both. Oftentimes, this is a re-articulation of things that are in the overview, but nevertheless, it's good to say. And if you have particular permutation answers, you would read those there, and then you would explain why your evidence should be preferred over theirs. For example, it's not a full card, but this is kind of a short block where we were on the AF, and we were not necessarily saying hegemony bad on the affirmative, but we were definitely saying imperialism that is inspired by the military-industrial complex is bad. And so teams were reading an argument that said hegemony was good against us, which is U.S. military might is good. And so we had a front line that said hegemony is bad for 2 reasons. We referred back to evidence that we had already read in the 1AC, extending across those arguments, and then we read more evidence. And when you were in the particular debate, you would actually read their evidence, see what the warrant is, and then answer it specifically inside of theirs, like the 3 on that block before you actually read it during the 2AC. That allows you some flexibility to have some truly good fidelity. Negative, for example, if you're reading a critique and they say realism is inevitable, well, this answers that argument that realism is inevitable. It says, not really. Here's some evidence we've already read that says that it actually is not inevitable. And here's some more evidence that explains why that's true. The last one, and I think this is probably arguably the easiest and the hardest to understand. Front lines are pre-prepared answers to a position. So when you're negative, think of things like advantages, solvency of the 1AC. Those would have front lines. What are your pre-prepared initial responses that you are going to make against an advantage or against the solvency of a particular 1AC? When you're affirmative, your front lines are going to be things like answering disads, critiques, topicality, framework, counterplans, possibly, etc., in case there's something I'm missing. The big thing here is that when you are creating a front line to a position, you are going to use the formula to answer it that is described in its particular video. For example, when you are looking at how do you answer a counterplan, you should use the spot method. So your 2AC front line to answer a counterplan should also follow the spot method. There should be solvency arguments. There should be a permutation. If you have offensive arguments or theory arguments, you read those as well. And then disads. Remember the videos about how you answer a disad. You would look for the offensive arguments that are there, and you would utilize them. So this is an argument that people make about why laptops should not be used in a debate. It's from a long time ago. It's pretty standard now that laptops are used, but it was an argument that was being made. And so these are pre-prepared arguments that answer the crux of their position and explained why it was a good idea to use laptops, and an impact turned that argument and provided some defensive arguments against their initial claims of being exclusionary inside of there. So this can kind of look like what their off-case sort of framework type position argument is. And so ultimately, the hope is now that you understand what writing blocks actually means and how there are three kind of different categories of writing blocks. But the ultimate goal is you want to be able to have the ability to have pre-scripted responses to positions and arguments, because that has a high return on investment in the sense that it can be used multiple debates in a row, and it increases the chances and likelihood that you will execute arguments the same way every time, which can maximize your chance for winning.